Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, it's an honor to welcome you all to Family Weekend, and thank you so much for spending your morning with us. I'd love to start with a brief introduction of the work that our center does. Our center was founded in 2012 following expressed interest and agitation by the part of students, alumni, staff, and a faculty steering committee that we establish a center here on campus that interrogates the university's relationship with the transatlantic slave trade. Our programs have had a really diverse and far-reaching focus, ranging from research clusters that bring together faculty, students, and community members to interrogate the various racial legacies of slavery, to projects that span artistic, film, and education foci, to public engagement, which includes a slavery and legacy walking tour that some of you may have tickets to, and a civil rights movement initiative, which I'll pause, and I think it's particularly important to talk about now in light of the national discussion of failing Providence public schools. Maya Gamble's River has led one of the most impressive parts of Brown's engagement with public schools by bringing a cohort of high school students on a civil rights movement initiative tour every year, and it's impacted, dozens of students. So I encourage you to talk to Maya about this. But it's within this vibrant and collaborative space that since 2015, I've been so privileged to direct a human trafficking research cluster, specifically drawing on the center's commitment to understand the contemporary racial and labor inequality in global perspectives. Where I teach and research around this issue really hones in on the year 2000 as a pivotal moment for the contemporary movement to combat human trafficking. It is in this year that the United Nations passes the Palermo Protocol and the US passes the subsequent Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which for the greater part of nearly 2 decades now have brought unbridled attention, commitment, and funding from governments, civil society, and even the private sector to address the issue of human trafficking. In its formal definition, many of these laws have recognized trafficking as defined by the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbor, or receipt of persons by means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of sexual exploitation or forced labor. With that definition in mind, there are 3 main projects that our work focuses on. A 2-year or multi-year funded project by the British Academy hoped to understand the new role that technology plays in addressing human trafficking. So this was a project that worked with undergrad research assistants, graduate students, and looked at new mobile phone technologies that are being given to migrant workers all over the world so that they can literally tweet or Yelp different kinds of labor exploitation that they might face. In 2016, we hosted an unprecedented 2-day-long conference on race and modern day abolition under the theme of whitewashing abolition that brought together experts on labor, migration, trafficking, deportation, and sex worker rights. This conference has resulted in an edited volume, now under contract with Routledge to be published in 2021, and as the focus of our work always is around engaging our students, includes a chapter that will be published by one of our students who graduated last year and wrote a thesis based on her work with the research cluster. At our core, we believe that human trafficking and labor exploitation are driven by a system of racialized global inequality exacerbated by uneven development and excessively punitive policies that often govern border control. At the same time, we are very cautious that the same racial hierarchies have the potential to inform rescue and helping initiatives. In other words, we interrogate the unintended consequences of trying to do good. And it's for this reason that we've decided to center our family weekend panel on our 3rd project, which is a community-based and engaged research collaborative with COYOTE, Rhode Island, the state's only sex worker rights organization. Our work with COYOTE puts sex workers and victims of sex trafficking expertise at the center of questions and answers that we face. Rhode Island is an ideal place to ask some of these questions, as you'll hear from the panel today. While the robust anti-trafficking movement did start as early as the 2000s, it was not until 2016 that Rhode Island got its first human trafficking shelter. Furthermore, due to a legislative loophole, prior to 2009, indoor prostitution was actually decriminalized in the state. And as one of only 2 states, Rhode Island and Nevada being the other, that was in which prostitution was decriminalized, I think it's a really unique test case to understand how and why the anti-trafficking movement has continually turned to policing, surveillance, and sometimes seeking carceral as opposed to social welfare or social justice responses. Our research cluster is open to anyone from campus, and for those of you who are interested in joining or who are interested in encouraging your students to join, I want to give you a sense of what a day in the life of our research cluster looks like. So students can engage in a variety of ways. Sometimes they just stop into lunchtime talks with scholars and have intimate discussions and opportunities to talk through ideas with these people whose books and writings really, really are at the core of our curriculum. Other times, this may branch into really extensive research projects. One of our esteemed alumni and board members, Catherine Chan, has actually generously funded a UTRA, which is an undergrad teaching research assistant fellowship every year, in which one of our students is able to have a paid research experience to research a number of topics. So in previous years, this has resulted in everything from somebody who is interrogating LGBTQ invisibility within the human trafficking movement to another student who wanted to look at the intersections between homelessness and their intersections with human trafficking. Based on these research experiences, we now have like a handful of award-winning student theses that have been written through the cluster's work, as well as impressive graduate school endeavors that you'll hear from Julie about, who's now a medical student at Brown. But other types of engagement need not be so academic. Yenhu will talk to you about building coalitions with Asian migrant workers spanning Seoul, Korea, Toronto, Canada, and New York City. And finally, last year, our research cluster collaboration with community partner COYOTE resulted in the introduction of a historic bill in Rhode Island that asks for a state-level study commission to interrogate the effects of the recriminalization of prostitution in 2009, which Matt is going to discuss. It was a really proud day last year to travel up to the State House Judiciary Committee and testify along with 5 other students to share the expertise that we've developed over the past couple of years. And here's a photo of Yenhu, Milana Krongleb, and Diana Tavares testifying. And on that note, it's an honor to turn it over to our presenters who, in the spirit of really engaging a conversation, thought that it'd be great if we just not have a formal talking to you, but if I ask them questions and then we open it up to a Q&A before. So I'll give them a brief introduction right now, and then I'll join them for a more informal roundtable discussion. Bela Robinson is the founder and executive director of COYOTE Rhode Island. She has worked in the sex industry for over 35 years and conducted numerous research projects. She is dedicated to supporting policies that reduce violence and exploitation and that promote the health and safety of sex workers. Yenhu Cho is a junior from Seoul and studies social analysis and research. Since fall 2008, she has conducted outreach to build coalition with Korean migrant workers in Providence and Pawtucket, as well as other Asian migrant workers organizations such as Red Canary Song and Butterfly. She considers her work a continuous learning and unlearning process as she wants to embrace this ambivalence in her gender justice, activism, and research. All the way at the end, Matthew Marcelo is a junior. So I was wrong because I put second year because in my heart, I want Matthew to stay a little longer. But he's a junior from Needham, Massachusetts, studying American Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies, focusing on queer studies in America. As part of COYOTE Rhode Island, he is both office manager and director of its new TV series called The Good Neighbors. For the CSSJ, he has been helping out as a research assistant. And finally, closest to me, Juliana Brown graduated in 2018 in the Health and Human Biology and Portuguese and Brazilian Studies concentrations. Throughout her time as an undergraduate, Juliana's work explored how sex workers experience the HIV continuum of care as a criminalized community. As a second-year student at the Warren Alpert Medical School at Brown, she has continued to examine how social and historical contexts shape health locally and globally, and has presented her work in conferences all over the world. Over the course of the past year, she has worked with COYOTE and faculty at the medical school to develop and implement a continuing education program for health providers on sex trafficking and sex work. So I'll join you all and invite you first to maybe all go around and each talk about a little bit about the work that has brought you into the center and your relationship with the CSSJ.
All right, I'll start on this end. Again, I'm Juliana. Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for coming out today. I first got involved with the research cluster during my time as an undergraduate here. I worked on a few research projects while I was living and studying in Brazil, and these projects were on PrEP care and HIV care and the Zika outbreak in Brazil. And both of these projects kind of brought to the forefront the involvement of sex workers and sex worker-led and run organizations in responding to both of these health crises. And given the very different position of sex workers in Brazil, the way that they were able to respond and support each other and support other people struggling with these conditions was very different. And then coming back to Providence, I met Bela here at a talk on campus and was interested in staying involved, and she was looking for a research assistant at that point. And yeah, the rest is history.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bela Robinson, and as you heard, I have been in the sex industry for 35 years. So I have a pretty good idea about the size of the market, different conditions, things that changed the sex industry. I've also worked under both criminalization and decriminalization. I'm probably one of the few people that you ever will meet that has worked under both models. Can tell you decriminalization was a lot better for many reasons. Part of the reason we relaunched COYOTE in 2010 was because in 2009 they recriminalized us. So one day our jobs were legal and the next day we were criminals. At the same time, we caught the Craigslist killer because after he killed the girl in Boston, he came to Rhode Island and robbed an escort who was able to dial 911 because she wasn't a criminal, and they caught him before he hurt anyone else. But part of my passion comes from the Gilgo Beach murders up in Long Island, where over a dozen sex workers were murdered and dumped. The murders are still unsolved. And I felt a moral responsibility to create change for the next generation of sex workers, because there will be a next generation of sex workers. I want to point out that poverty, criminalization, and immigration laws are the three factors that fuel trafficking and exploitation and violence. And a matter of fact, today we have 3 million college students that have accounts on a website called Seeking Arrangements, seeking sugar daddies because of tuition and student loan debts.
Hello, my name is Yeon Hu. I started joining this research cluster by starting working with COYOTE in fall 2018. Through Professor Shih in her class called Transnational Research and Ethnography. It was basically a class where everyone got to choose a site and participate in a community and engage research questions based on, with qualitative methods, really centering like my inductive reasoning, reflections based on observation. And my site was COYOTE, Rhode Island. And my final project of that semester was about my reflection on doing outreach to Korean massage parlors in Providence and Pawtucket. And now I still continue to work as a migrant research outreach project manager in COYOTE, doing this kind of outreach every month for about a year with the same Korean massage workers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Marcelo. I took Professor Shih's class my first year. She was my first year advisor, so it felt very appropriate to take her class. And I learned about the whole anti-trafficking rescue narrative and the impact on sex workers. And this past summer, I was doing some research with Professor Shih and COYOTE, helping out in any way I can. For Professor Shih, I was looking at the sex industry in Providence, Rhode Island, and then increasingly bringing the lens out further to the US and cross-nationally into Canada, for instance. And then I just kind of got plugged in out of my interest in gender and sexuality studies and American studies, kind of the whole idea where sex workers are at the intersection of a lot of different types of marginalization. So it just feels very appropriate to be able to understand what they're facing in order to understand all the other types of societal oppression, especially as someone interested in queer studies. And I would like to point out that, for instance, Stonewall, which is often marked as kind of the start of like the modern day queer rights movement, was started by trans women of color who were sex workers. And these people are continually erased from history for their, as I said, intersecting ways in which they're marginalized.
Thank you all so much. Bela, I want to invite you. I think what's part of what is so valuable in our collaborations together and what students really learn from you is both your personal experience with policing, with incarceration, with trafficking and sex work, but also how you've funneled that into really important questions. So I'd love for you to do both. On the one hand, tell us a little bit about those personal experiences, and then tell us how that resulted in the first study that we worked on together.
I would say one of the things about the cluster that has been really awesome is not only has it given us the resources to conduct community-based researches, because sex workers have a slogan that we like to say, nothing about us without us. We demand to be a part of any policies, studies that impact us. So on the other hand, academics probably wouldn't be able to engage with our population if they didn't build some trust. Because when researchers I don't know want to give me a survey, my first question is, who are you? What do you want? Because they throw us under the bus over and over again. When we talk about the trafficking narrative, let me point out it's the biggest growth industry since the 2009 recession other than low-paying jobs. Funded at about $2 billion a year. Money is given under the Trafficking in Persons report to NGOs to create awareness about trafficking, to go out and teach their community how to spot trafficking. They're asking the public to be vigilantes, kind of like slave catchers. This result of, during these raids and rescues, there's two ways it can go. If you'll say you're a victim, you are dumped into a shelter with no services, and usually you go back to sex work, or they tell you, well, you can create an NGO and create yourself a job. If you won't say you're a victim, you were arrested, your name and picture is published in the media. We can understand how none of these things are helping to make anybody whole. But the most problematic part of this funding stream is those receiving the funding cannot support decriminalization, harm reduction from sex workers, or even engage with sex worker right-led organizations. Sadly to say that about 30% of all the crisis calls that sex worker-led organizations are receiving are referrals from these heavily funded trafficking organizations that can't seem to offer people any of the services they need to meet their daily needs.
Could you tell us a little bit about how some of the problems informed the 2005 research project?
Sure.
The survey.
The survey. So it started out with a good friend of mine, Tara Burns in Alaska, who surveyed 30 or 40 sex workers for her master's. And we were able to bring her to Brown and learn about it, and she allowed us to use her same questions. And we thought, well, Alaska and Rhode Island have about the same population, about 1 million. We want to see what the similarities are. And the data was almost identical. We surveyed 63 Rhode Island sex workers. 77% of them said they would not report violence due to fear of arrest, being threatened with arrest, outing their coworkers, or they didn't think the police would do anything. For the 4% that did report, or of those that did report, 4% were arrested and 26% of them were threatened with arrest. 24% of them reported being robbed, raped, and assaulted by police officers. So when we think about criminalization and immigration laws, when you have the ability to threaten someone, get them arrested, have them evicted, and have their children taken away, you can kind of understand how you gave all the power to the predator. But the rescue industry thinks that we need to be arrested and captured and put in cages, locked down in shelters where we can be controlled to make sure we don't go back to sex work, while they don't advocate for some of the things that we advocate for. We're out advocating for Medicaid for all, affordable housing, the fair licensing campaign, jobs that create a living wage. Because we know if youth services to support our youth so they don't have to engage in survival sex. We know if we create services, people will come and we will not need to arrest them. People who want to exit will have the ability to exit. So part of this narrative is to disrupt sex workers, disrupt their stability, displace them. So when you're arrested, if you're not arrested, you went home and were able to buy groceries and pay your rent and your electric bill, but instead now you're arrested or dragged to some shelter or diversion court where all these people around you are profiting off your criminalization. And we have this kind of like ongoing joke is, can we at least get a rescue sandwich?
Oftentimes in our work, we see that voluntary sex work and then forced sex trafficking are really framed as diametrically opposed. And some of what our research has uncovered that victims of sex trafficking who seek to leave and voluntary sex workers both faced harm at the hands of state violence and then maybe also clients, but it is criminalization that inhibits our ability to address these. I'd love to turn it over to Julie, who's been working in a collaboration with the Rhode Island STD clinic at Miriam Hospital for the past couple months to develop an intervention that works with medical professionals in their capacity as oftentimes first contact or first responders to people who are experiencing trafficking and to our sex workers.
Great. Yeah, so this past year, I've been working on a series of educational materials for healthcare providers, and these programs are focused on how to provide the best care possible to sex workers and people that have experienced trafficking. And these programs came out of the conclusions of my thesis that I worked on with Bela and with COYOTE in 2017. The data was collected, and it was a large nationwide survey, and I worked with the section of the survey that focused on health and healthcare. And a lot of the conclusions that came out of this study had to do with building trust with healthcare professionals, because if sex workers don't feel that they can go to any site of healthcare, a hospital, a clinic, urgent care, and receive care and not be reported and not be arrested for going to seek care, then they're not going to engage with any form of healthcare. And so the CMEs that I've been working on are, CME is continuing medical education, and the programs that we're putting together are in the format of continuing medical education for physicians, continuing nursing education programs for nurses and nurse practitioners, and then CE programs, continuing education programs for social workers and for support staff that work in healthcare environments. And so we're looking to put together these 4-credit trainings for anyone who works in a healthcare setting and who comes in contact with patients, because we know that it's not just physicians, it's not just nurses. When someone walks in the door of a healthcare facility, there's a lot of people that they come in touch with, and there's kind of a lot of places where trust can either be built or broken. And so these are looking to be comprehensive programs. They are 4-credit programs, and so to remain accredited in a healthcare setting, anyone needs a certain number of continuing education requirements, and it varies by state, it varies by institution, and by profession. But what's so exciting about these programs is they're 4-credit, and so they're to a certain extent mandatory, because you need a certain amount of continuing education credits, and oftentimes people get to choose what they're learning about, but we're looking to engage with healthcare professionals who have no previous exposure to the conversations like the ones we're having now, and are not exposed to the complexities of caring for people who have done sex work, who are currently doing sex work, who are not facing exploitation in their work, who are facing exploitation in their work. And so these programs are going to be implemented through the Miriam STI clinic. and available on an online platform and available as in-person trainings for anyone in the state of Rhode Island to receive credit. And a lot of the major parts of these training programs are a basic history of what sex work is and what it isn't, the history that Bela just described of sex work specifically in the state of Rhode Island, and then a series of best practices for healthcare professionals on how to provide effective and high-quality healthcare to sex workers. And one of the largest takeaways that I'm hoping comes out of these programs for people that participate in the education is that healthcare can be a really critical site of support for sex workers, but it can also be a site of sex workers feeling further isolated from the services that they're looking to receive to just care for themselves, keep themselves well and all right, and that there are very specific challenges that sex workers face in caring for their own health and in accessing health care due to their status as a criminalized and stigmatized population. And the programs kind of ask providers to consider their role as a healthcare provider in caring for sex workers and like what is ultimately what is their role, and it is to provide health care, to see patients as they are, as they come in, and listen to what they need, and if they're able to meet those healthcare needs, to meet them. And the role of a provider is not necessarily to place their own judgments or expectations onto their patients, and their place is not to report patients who are not looking to be reported. I think also there's a lot of misconceptions around mandated reporting among healthcare providers, and physicians often think that they're mandated to report things that they are not mandated to report, and involvement in the sex industry is not something that's mandated to report, but a lot of sex workers don't seek out health care for fear of being reported, for having their children taken away, for being punished, and kind of getting a dialogue going amongst healthcare professionals that reporting patients and suggesting to their patients that they will be reported if they ever disclose is not necessarily helpful.
Thanks so much, Julie. I want to take this opportunity to shift globally. Over the past several years, our students have worked in research projects everywhere from Greece to France to Brazil, Mexico. And so I want to invite Yenhu to talk a little bit about the transnational dimensions of your work and your orientation to this research cluster as an international student from Seoul.
Okay, so when I said massage work before, Asian massage worker, I mean it as a form of indoor sexual labor, often done as a collective rather than alone to ensure workers' safety. Why do they do it? Research found out that individuals choose to do massage work for a variety of reasons, of course, but mainly to meet basic needs or to ensure economic security, or even to resist other kinds of oppression. And many workers choose to participate in massage work, showing its precarity instead of, or even in addition to, other lower paying jobs that's typically assigned to Asian women in North America, such as domestic labor. I know a lot of people may question what if they are trafficking victims. I think it is the most common and natural response, given that we're living in a world that makes us really incapable of imagining anyone who would possibly want to do this kind of work voluntarily. I'm not saying that all massage workers are completely free of violence. Trafficking victims do exist. All I'm saying is that a lot of violence and oppression they experience come from this exact moral panic surrounding the very people, their bodies. And this moral panic is co-opted by the nation state and the law enforcement. When you look at the result of the times, this country uses the narrative of, oh, we need to save these poor Asian women. It's really hard to believe that they actually care about them. And when they start using sex work and sex trafficking interchangeably, as Professor Shih has said, it's so easy for them to kind of pick and choose. So they can basically choose to justify their involvement of criminal justice system in cases by saying that, oh, we need to save these women, but also kind of deport them or even say things like, oh, these are bad neighbors of this town. So if there's one thing that I can say about this, based on my outreach, a year-long outreach project that I done with Bela, COYOTE, and Professor Shih, is that what I see at the outreach is very different from this kind of narrative. The Korean women that I see every month are cis women of age ranging from 30s to 60s, immigrants minding their own business. There's a long history of state violence and oppression that they have faced in Rhode Island. 10 years ago, when indoor sex work was about to be recriminalized, Korean massage workers were the one who stood up, came to the State House, and informed the policymakers and that nobody's forcing them to work in the parlors, and that they just need to make money, and of course, criminalization will only jeopardize their livelihood. And now we still see women being arrested almost every other year by the police, and the most recent one was in March and April this year. And so I've been reflecting a lot of outreach itself. I know a lot of outreach, well-intentioned maybe, resulted in way more harm than good by to these massage workers, and the result of this kind of outreach is, in the past, includes arrest, but not just arrest, like confiscation of their money earned through sex work because sex work is considered criminal activity, and even potentially deportation if they're undocumented. I think my most urgent research question right now is how should researchers and outreach workers really acknowledge this problematic genealogy of outreach, that it stems from falsely narrated white heroism and the imbalance of nationwide funding that imposes anti-prostitution stance on nonprofit organizations. Other questions that I have are like, what kind of knowledge should we create about these migrant sex workers, and how should we engage with them in order to do that? If we want to correctly inform the people and the government to remove the stigma and the hate that the sex workers face now, how do we do that if we want to influence policies and legislations in a way that it does not constrain sex workers' economic empowerment, agency, and migration, mobility like it does now? So these are the questions that I have, and in order to answer those, I am seeking coalition with organization in North America, mainly Northeast, spearheaded by Asian sex workers. I'm collaborating with Red Canary Song in Queens, New York. I'm trying to go to New York every month to see them, and since they are really working hard to pass this new New York State decriminalization bill right now, I'm trying to go there every month and do whatever I can to support them, advocate for them. And in the future, I will be participating in their oral history project, where I might potentially do oral history with workers in Rhode Island. And another organization that I'm looking forward to meeting actually next weekend is Butterfly in Toronto, Canada. It's a group of more than 200 fierce Asian sex workers in Toronto. They're doing really amazing work. And I'm visiting them next weekend to attend their training, which is about offering knowledge and information to service providers of any sectors so that they are equipped with skills that's adequate and relevant for migrant sex workers. Yeah, so I think, so my work is a really mixed bag of like a lot of topics: migration, sex work, and racism, a lot of like, etc. I think it's okay to feel whatever you feel towards sex industry, but I would still encourage you to be critical when you receive information or facts through local media, the law enforcement, and also be critical about how the government tells this narrative.
Thanks, Yenhu. I think Yenhu's comments really point to some curious entanglements that anti-trafficking work has with mass incarceration and then also with deportation when it comes to our migrant communities. One of the things that I love about this research cluster is when students approach me and they say, I'm not interested in human trafficking at all, but I'm actually interested in X, Y, or Z or the other thing, because I think X, Y, or Z or the other thing are the way that we really, really widen our understanding of all of the different kind of social development protection issues that inform trafficking. So one of the things that we were able to do last year was, through the research cluster, hold space at the CSSJ for an anti-deportation legal clinic for local Cambodian residents who are facing deportation right now. So that kind of coalition building work is really important in establishing relationships with our community members and having an impact on policy. And so, to round out this roundtable, I'd love to invite Matt to talk a little bit about this historic House bill that reached the floor this past April.
Yeah, so earlier this year, House Bill 5354, which is about establishing a study commission about the history and current state of sex work under criminalization, with the possibility of revising them. Currently, just to catch you all up, the bill is kind of caught up in committee. It will be reintroduced next year. But basically what the bill is about is it's with the recognition that the criminalization of sex work disproportionately affects those who are already marginalized, including people of color, trans people, especially trans women. The bill is centered around those narratives. So with the bill being passed, it would establish a study commission with 12 members, including at least one representative from COYOTE, Rhode Island. It would also include at least a couple of voices who are currently in the sex industry. And what that would do is kind of create a large coalition of voices so that everyone's voice is at the table to understand what's currently going on under criminalization, with the fact that it's been 10 years now, with decriminalization being overturned, and kind of pulling all these different facts together from the different studies that you've heard about, everything from narratives around STI rates, the fact that gonorrhea rates fell by about 33% under decriminalization, understanding how under decriminalization forcible rape fell by around the same rate as well. So kind of pulling all that together and understanding it from a social science, humanities point of view, activist point of view, academic point of view, to just pull everyone together and see what we can do about these issues, because clearly criminalization is not working, as we've been talking about. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. And we're actually so lucky and so grateful that the sponsor of our bill, Representative Anastasia Williams, in the back, has joined us today. So thank you so much for joining us. So on that note, and with these really different perspectives that are on the floor, I'd love to open it up to all of you to field questions and answers. They can be everything from, as parents, I think one of the most questions that I hear Bela get asked the most is, what is your relationship with your daughter like, seeing as how you're a sex worker? So anything from the intimately personal to the more intellectual, we're happy to field all of these questions, in addition to talk more about how to get involved. So I'd love to turn it over to Q&A. Yes?
I'm curious from a public policy perspective, and obviously research that you're doing is vitally important to inform that the public policy response, but if one moves to decriminalization, which seems clearly the right answer, what are strategies to actually attack trafficking? Because normally in the legislative process, legislators want to vote for a combination of different solutions to a problem. So you're all describing very well why criminalization does not work. How does one orient the police to go after the traffickers in a way that avoids abuse of women? And how does one really construct a total response to this problem that allows legislators to vote against human trafficking even as they vote to decriminalize sex work?
So one of the most difficult, I'll speak very briefly because I know Bella wants a chance to answer this, but one of the most difficult entanglements between protection and prosecution right now is that the United States has an amazing trafficking amnesty program. We have a trafficking visa designated for victims of trafficking, but one of the reasons why it's so hard to get that visa is because you have to be present and willing to testify against your traffickers. So much of the ability to actually prosecute the traffickers is tied up in victims, but ultimately inability of victims to access services, fear of retribution. And I think to like detangle those processes and really, really focus on victim protection as an area that's a little bit distinct from criminal investigation would be helpful. We see so many of the resources being poured into policing and surveillance, really hard-hitting immigrants and not necessarily organized crime. So if we redirect like vice towards organized crime, that may be one way to do so. Thanks.
That's a great question because nobody is against sex trafficking more than sex workers. Actually, most trafficking victims were already sex workers. Very rarely is someone kidnapped or forced or introduced that way. Even our youth are usually under their own control, and you know, we don't want our youth involved in this. But some of the problems is there's no trust with police. In New Zealand, when they decriminalized, they set up a study commission from the government to do a 5-year review of how that law worked. They found the majority of sex workers felt they had more rights, improved relationships with police. In the UK, there's another place that they do the Merseyside law. Even though it's illegal to sell or buy sex, the police have said enough of the violence. Any crime against a sex worker is now classified as a hate crime, and their prosecution for rape on sex workers went up dramatically. I want to point out in Rhode Island, they're only testing 30% of all rape kits. The rape kits go to the health department, and the police have to tell them which ones, so the police obviously don't think 70% of the rapes are worth investigating. So we need to build trust with police. We need to build trust with service providers. We need to create an environment where sex workers in crisis can get the support they need. There's a big gray area of domestic violence. Now, if I were to tell a domestic violence victim that Joe's not your husband, you could understand how offensive that would be. I might want to start with, maybe you're not in a healthy relationship. Can we talk about that? So when NGOs are telling sex workers during raids and rescues and outreach that Joe is really not your boyfriend or your roommate or your partner, they've broken all trust already, and there's no way to help them. So a lot of this is going to have to take place in sensitivity training, but I think sex workers could be the best tool we have to fight trafficking.
Yeah. One of the there are a lot of complicated dynamics that exist when with research in marginalized communities. But one dynamic I've noticed is that oftentimes, like I see on Twitter, for example, people will, from those communities will respond to like a news study by saying, "Oh, we already knew this." Like, if we'd only, if you would listen to sex workers, or if you would listen to black people, or whatever the study, whatever population is being studied, then you wouldn't have needed to do this study. At the same time, research can be a powerful validating tool for conversations with the broader public, and trying to pass legislation. And so I was just curious if that's how you all navigate that dynamic, I guess.
Well, I'll talk real quick. The second research project we did is we collaborated with Desiree Alliance and SWAT Behind Bars. We came up with 145 questions that we asked 1,515 sex workers. So think about how much data that is. We're currently writing an ebook on our findings that starts with the Alaska work, the Rhode Island work. We also did a research project after FOSTA passed. FOSTA was Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act that was passed in 2018 that literally put sex sex workers globally in crisis. We saw violence and exploitation soar through the roof. Screening procedures went down 28%. Many websites shuttered and went down where sex workers shared information about dangerous people and built a lot of community and safety networks. So it's interesting. I'll also point out that any government research on trafficking has to focus on how to catch traffickers and prosecute them. They don't seem too interested about the people involved and how to make them whole or anything like that. So that leaves us in a pickle, and that's another great reason why this research cluster is so important.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and what you were describing has definitely happened when it comes to sex workers, and especially health outcomes among sex workers. The situation that you were describing has very much happened where for decades, I mean, for a long time, sex workers globally have been very well organized, have been very vocal, and have been saying that criminalization keeps us, prevents us from keeping ourselves safe, prevents us from keeping ourselves healthy. We want to be able, we deserve to be healthy and safe, and criminalization is stopping us from doing both of those things. And sex workers have been present at summits, at conferences for decades, and really struggling to make themselves heard. And then research gets funded, comes to those same exact conclusions, and very slowly those statements become validated through peer-reviewed research. And there's a great article that came out recently by Platt et al., if anyone is looking for a good meta-analysis of criminalization and health outcomes. But it basically found what sex workers have been saying forever, which is that health outcomes systematically were better under less severe criminalization, and it looked at different legal models. It looked at the Nordic model, legalization versus decriminalization. And so when it comes to conducting research, I think a way to address this, and a way to kind of more quickly produce research, and research that has more meaningful conclusions that are not just what sex workers have already been saying, is to work with sex workers. It's a very straightforward process. I think what was so exciting about the thesis that I was very lucky to get to work on is that I worked with the data that Bela collected, and that the research team was community-based, that the project was started and led by sex workers. And I think that in doing research, and hopefully in research that we've been putting together and proposing for the future, having sex workers as paid members of your research team, not just stipends or funded as participants, but as paid equal members of a research team, and being able to put together research questions and be actively involved in this process goes a long way, especially in a community that's criminalized and is not going to be engaging with research in a candid and open manner otherwise.
Last question.
Hello, thank you all again for being here. So obviously the principal goal is to pass legislation that would decriminalize sex work. Unfortunately, even after 10 years, the quote-unquote political will isn't necessarily there just yet. However, before we even do get there, what can we do in the present right now in terms of trying to pass other forms of legislation that could help sex workers? For example, you had mentioned the fact that only 30% of rape kits are tested. We could pass mandates that would require all rape kits to be tested.
Let's take two at a time, because we're at time, and so we'll just take the last question at the same time.
Hi everyone, thank you for your presentations, very informative. One of the questions, and I really appreciated the statement, nothing about us without us. So kind of a two-part question is, to what degree have any of your studies consulted with trafficking survivors and anti-trafficking organizations, recognizing that the commercial sex industry is very heterogeneous? There are sex workers, and whether someone is a sex worker or a trafficking victim, there is violence throughout and an overlap. To what degree have trafficking survivors been involved in the studies and the research cluster? And then related to that question, the previous question, the bill, is a study also going to look at all the other root causes you mentioned about housing, poverty, and it seems like it's not just a matter of criminalization or decriminalization, but there are a lot of other deep systemic issues that need to be addressed, and whether it's criminalized or not, that's not going to be a silver bullet to address issues around violence and exploitation. Thank you.
Those are great questions. One, there are many things that we can do as far as harm reduction. Senator Sam Bell has introduced a bill. He'll be introducing it again next year. Senate Bill 317 that will make it a 3-year felony for peace officers to engage in sex with people detained or in custody. So this is if you're a police officer, probation officer, anyone that has control can threaten to send you to jail. It doesn't matter, it can't be consensual. California just did something historical, Senate Bill 233, that prohibits law enforcement for using condoms as evidence, because we can all understand how that doesn't promote public health and safety, right? It also gives sex workers immunity if they come forward to report a crime. They cannot be prosecuted. So these are harm reduction steps. And as far as the study commission, our research, I think it was about 6 or 7% of people felt that they had been exploited or trafficked at some time, but all of them had already been doing sex work. Once they were able to get away from their abuser, they were able to do sex work independently without abuse. So we're not denying that there are bad people out there who exploit people, but let's think of some of the factors that make people vulnerable. Poverty, not having stable housing, women that are rescued and sent to shelters are treated very badly. Our homeless population will tell you how badly they're treated. So those are, 15 an hour, Medicaid, social services, youth services. Let's invest in LGBT halfway houses and youth drop-in centers rather than wasting resources arresting 56-year-old spa workers in Pawtucket who just want to be left alone. Outreach through sex workers. In Australia, sex work organizations are funded. They do outreach and drop-ins to these locations, so if something bad's going on, they're seeing it, they're building trust, so people can tell them. Even if the police go into a spa under decriminalization, they can ask everyone for ID to make sure everyone's adult. They can hand out their card. Hey ladies, if you have any problems, give us a call, let us know. You build trust. Whether we're under decrim or criminalization, sex work does not go away, and the size of the market remains the same. There's many myths that it increases. We see in Germany and New Zealand and even in Rhode Island, the size of the market stays the same.
Okay, we are out of time, but I want to give Representative Williams the last question because she's been poking her hand up. All right, here we go.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, it's not necessarily a formal question, but I want to express some of the suggestion, if I may. My brother here got up and boom, that's why I raised my hands, because I strongly believe for every question that is asked, there are answers to them. So there are answers to every question that was asked here today, not only in the research that's being done, but within yourselves. We need individuals that are in this room, each one to reach one, and to come to the State House, because 5354 is going to be introduced again. And with those questions come with the answers, because you have them. You're looking for them, but you have them yourselves. So I would say to everyone that's listening and hearing my voice to please come, because without you, that General Assembly, my colleagues, they are not going to move forward with this at all, because it's not affecting them directly. And until we educate the community of the reality and the facts of what's happening, it's going to be always a study commission. We have been studied long enough. It is time for us to act, and the only way things are going to happen, if we so choose, make it happen. Thank you.
Can't think of a better way to end today, and we are at time, so I want to give enormous gratitude to all of you, and on behalf of our center director, Tony Bogues, assistant director, Shayna Weinberg, manager of programs and outreach, Mael Gamber-Rivers, and our center coordinator, Catherine Van Amberg. Thank you all, and we'd love to continue the conversation. Please join us across the street at 94 Waterman for light refreshments, as well as an opportunity to see our exhibit on memory dishes that's up. Thank you all so much, and thanks to the panelists.